Good morning, everyone. My name is Adrian Quintner, and I'm a Principal Associate specialising in construction and engineering risks in our insurance disputes practice here at Mills and Reeve. I'm joined today by my colleagues Sophie Briggs and Nathan Jones, who also specialise in construction and engineering risks. Morning, both.
Morning.
Morning.
So today we'll be looking at the regulatory framework tackling climate change, the impact of climate change on claims, and underwriting the risks. It's a massive topic and we can't cover everything today, but we hope you'll come away with a better insight into some of the key issues. Before we start, just a bit of housekeeping. Please note this session is being recorded and will be available later to you. But whilst you can see us, we can't see you. If you have any questions, then please feel free to drop them into the Q&A box at the bottom. Bearing in mind this is a bite-sized session and we'll be covering a lot of material, we won't have time to do a Q&A at the end, but we'll try to come back to you by email as soon as we can after the session. So let's get started. Sophie, what's on the agenda, please?
Thanks, Adrian. So the agenda today looks like this. We're going to start by talking about some of the regulatory reforms that have already come into effect to mitigate the impacts of climate change. We're then going to talk about a couple of areas where we can see that there's potential risks down the road, such as flood risks and the use of new materials and techniques. We're also going to discuss some potential contractual considerations that construction professionals may need to think about. And finally, we are going to look at how climate change issues might impact on policy terms for PI policies and some other types of policies.
Thanks, Sophie. Before we get into these topics, can you give us an overview of why climate change is becoming a big issue in the construction industry?
Yeah, I think it's worth thinking about this, both in terms of the impact that the sector is having on climate change and in terms of how climate change will impact the sector. So to get us started, you'll see on the slide, we've got a poll for you. So what contribution do you think the construction industry is estimated to make to the world's CO2 emissions? And you can choose 35, 40 or 50%. So if you can please choose now. I'm just waiting for a moment whilst everyone makes their choice and hopefully we'll get the results come through. Okay, so the vast majority of people, well, actually it's pretty close, but the majority of people have said 40%, and that is actually right. So globally, it's estimated that the construction industry contributes 40% to the world's annual CO2 emissions. Understandably, that means it's a sector which is going to come under scrutiny as governments around the world are trying to address and mitigate the risks of climate change. So that means that those in the construction industry can expect to be, and already are to some extent, subject to tighter regulations and encouraged to think about the best way to build in a sustainable manner. At the same time, those in the construction industry have a duty to ensure that what they build is fit for purpose and can withstand the reasonably foreseeable impacts of climate change, which for the UK at least is likely to involve higher rainfall, greater flood risk and hotter summers. So, Adrian, thinking about the scrutiny that the sector is already under, what are the regulations that are currently enforced to seek to mitigate climate change risk?
Well, certain amendments to the Building Regulations 2010 came into force on the 15th of June 2022. They now apply to all projects where building work started on or after 15th of June 2023. Various updated and new approved documents provide technical guidance on the amendments. These are highlighted on this slide. So, for example, the building regulations now require installation of electric vehicle charge points or cable routes for certain buildings and specify the number required in each case. Approved Document S provides the technical guidance on the requirements and applies to new buildings, buildings undergoing a material change of use to dwellings, and buildings undergoing major renovation. Another example is the introduction of glazing limits in new build homes, care homes, schools, and student accommodation to reduce unwanted solar gains in the summer and indoor heat. Approved Document O provides technical guidance on these requirements.
Okay, so that's a good start. What else is coming down the track from a regulatory perspective?
Well, the Future Home Standard and Future Building Standard will introduce stricter rules in 2025. This is meant to ensure new homes built from 2025 produce 75 to 80% less carbon emissions than homes completed under current regulations.
That sounds like it could make quite a big difference. So what do those regulations mean for professionals?
Well, construction professionals need to keep up to date with the latest regulations because non-compliance could lead to a professional negligence claim. For example, what if an architect doesn't incorporate an adequate number of electric charge points or doesn't factor in the required glazing limits in its designs for a block of flats? Or if the designs are fine, but the contractor doesn't follow them? These scenarios could lead to a claim. For example, if remedial works are required to ensure compliance with the building regulations.
Okay, that's all really interesting. So are there any other existing regulations or legislation that need to be taken into account?
Yes, it's not just the building regulations and approved documents that are consciously targeting climate change that need to be considered. Existing legislation that wasn't even designed with climate change in mind may also be relevant. A good example is Section 1 of the Defective Premises Act 1972, which imposes a duty on those taking on work or in connection with the provision of a dwelling to ensure that the dwelling is fit for habitation when completed. Given the time it can take for a building to progress from conception to practical completion, a failure to anticipate the effect of rising temperatures or increased heavy rainfall or flood risk on living conditions by the time the building is complete could result in claims against architects, engineers, and contractors. All of this poses a big question for the construction industry. If you design buildings to be super sustainable and address the user's needs, that can massively increase the build costs, which then makes it less affordable. And developers might not want that, as it will impact on profit margins. So the construction industry may well have to tread a careful balancing act with one eye on the regulatory and legal framework to meet obligations and avoid claims, and another on the commercial reality. So, Sophie, I'm going to turn back to you now. Can you give us some more concrete examples of potential risks?
Sure. So one area where we can see there might be risks going forward is flood risk. So flooding at the moment already affects 1 in 6 homes, but with the increased weather events and high sea levels, the number of houses at risk is expected to double by 2050. Governments and the Environment Agency are obviously aware of those risks, and in terms of planning policy, the way to mitigate those risks appears to be better flood defences and ensuring that developments are built to suitable levels and with appropriate mitigation measures in place. So in some cases, this has resulted in new designs and engineering ideas that are seeking to address the potential problem there. The image that you've got on the screen is floating homes in Amsterdam, and they've also designed amphibious homes which sit on land but float when water encroaches. So in some ways that's quite exciting for the construction industry because it's an opportunity to be creative and come up with these sort of new ideas. But inevitably new ways of doing things can lead to risks. So for example, using new materials that contractors might be less familiar with, that could result in risks. And we'll come back to that a bit later. Another potential issue around flood risk is the delay that flooding events might have on development sites, even if the site isn't negatively affected. So in terms of materials, access to the site, that sort of thing. So it's important to think about whether that's adequately addressed in contract terms.
Thanks. But how can professionals protect against flood risk?
So a major factor is to ensure that data used for flood risk analysis on site is accurate and up to date with the latest climate change information, and that appropriate measures have been built in to mitigate any risks and the impact on the development site itself. and also the effects on surrounding areas, because otherwise you can see that there's potential for nuisance-related claims that could be quite substantial. So, for example, we've seen a claim where an engineer misinterpreted flood risk data, and when the next flood occurred, the drainage and the flood prevention measures that were in place just couldn't cope. So that resulted in substantial losses associated with the damage from the floods, but it also gave rise to really difficult issues about how to redesign the building that had already been built.
Okay, so what other risks are emerging issues?
So another issue is likely to be how the construction industry deals with extreme heat. So we're obviously in a heat wave at the moment. 2023 was the hottest year on record. Heat impacts on the construction industry in a physical sense, so having to think about workers' welfare in the heat, dealing with water shortages on site, which might affect concrete, dust. All of those things can result in delay on a development site. Extreme heat will also lead to thinking about materials and designs and whether they are fit for purpose in the changing environment. So that might mean looking at materials to keep buildings cooler, with bigger cavities, appropriate insulation, that sort of thing. That then leads to thinking about the issues which might come from using sustainable materials. So, for example, concrete is generally considered to be pretty awful in environmental terms, and a lot of low carbon designs are now moving towards the use of timber. However, certain types of timber, particularly cross-laminate timber, where the sections are glued together, require careful storage so that they don't get wet. And we've dealt with a claim before where once the building was constructed, parts of the building started to deflect, which means bend. And one of the issues that the experts raised was whether the timber had been properly stored during construction, because otherwise it could have been causative of the defects that subsequently manifested in that building. It's possible that more claims of that nature will be coming down the track as the construction industry uses new materials, and possibly things that contractors are less familiar with when they're constructing new projects.
Okay, and are there any other areas we should be looking at?
So I think another area is the construction of renewable energy plants themselves. So we've already seen the case of MT Royard and E.ON, which was about the first offshore wind farm in Scotland. And in that case, the issue was about the design of the wind turbine bases. We've seen another case about a wind farm in the North Sea where they had problems with the steelwork because the steelwork hadn't been designed to withstand the sea environment. On a slightly different theme, we've had a case where there's been defects in a solar-powered industrial plant which caused a fire. So all of those things take us back to the same point, which is that with exciting new technologies, there's always going to be risks as the tech develops.
Some really interesting examples there of risks associated with professionals working in new and developing technologies. So how do we mitigate some of these risks?
Well, as ever, it's always important for construction professionals to stay up to date with regulatory requirements, as you were saying earlier, Adrian, and ensure that their designs and buildings are meeting those requirements. It's also worth making sure that you're using up-to-date information. So, check the current water levels for flood risk analysis, recheck them during construction if the project is live for a long period. When specifying the use of certain materials, if they are ones that contractors might be less familiar with, then it might be worth highlighting specific risks to them, or at least referring those on site to the guidance available to attempt to mitigate those possible issues. It's also probably worth just thinking about whether you have the skills needed to be advising on the new technology, and obviously whether your insurance covers the risks coming out of those projects.
Okay, so we've covered some of the regulatory and legal requirements that the sector needs to think about, and some examples of how climate change might bring those requirements into play. Nathan, how might this influence the way projects are managed and employers' demands?
So thus far, what we've really seen is the focus of regulations has been on operational carbon, and that's the carbon emitted during the in-use phase of a building, and is therefore more relevant to design issues. The shift we're now starting to see is more of a focus on managing embodied carbon. That's the carbon footprint of a building or project before it becomes operational. So essentially the footprint of constructing whatever it is that it may be. That naturally brings with it the risk that we're likely to start seeing new requirements on site, a bit like some of those Sophie alluded to earlier. and attached to those new expectations from employers.
Can you explain a bit more what you mean about the requirements for projects?
Yeah, so the industry has done what you might expect and started by looking at contractual requirements. And there are quite a few examples of clauses the sector is suggesting employers, contractors, architects, and so on use. And a list of some of the notable ones is there on the slide. It's important to note at the outset, though, that breaches of them are unlikely to give rise to a third-party loss triggering a PI insurer's liability. What they're much more likely to do is lead to a first-party loss, which might just, for example, hit a D&O policy or a niche PI policy. That said, we thought we'd touch on a couple of them, as they might become commonplace in future, and it's something we all need to keep in mind. Now, the three examples you can see on this slide come from different places around the industry. That's the Chancery Lane project and the standard JCT and NEC contract basis. They aren't compulsory, and it'll be down to those in the industry to decide amongst themselves whether clauses like this are used. Of these, we think the one with the greatest impact will be the climate standard of care that's proposed by Chancery Lane. What that seeks to do is to get parties to agree to perform the works to a higher standard tied to net zero objectives of a particular project. The mechanism they've opted to suggest for doing that is warranties. So as you'll see on the slide with clause 1.2 towards the top. What it suggests there is that where a contractor fails to adhere to and then rectify their climate performance on the project, they're to be treated as having performed a substantial breach to which a usual default clause will apply. It's worth noting at this stage that a breach of that warranty may well be excluded from any PI insurance cover, for example, under a contractual liability exclusion, given the contractor would likely have signed up to and breached an obligation greater than would be implied in tort. Now, I'm just going to briefly mention the other two clauses on the slide as well. What they both seek to do is to encourage environmental performance and sustainability. So, for example, use of renewable power on site, although the NEC proposal has more teeth. That's because it's more prescriptive over the consequence of any breach, which could include financial penalties. Given they're both intended to be tied to targets, what we're also seeing is they're underpinned by a requirement for a contractor to provide climate information that the employer requests so that the employer can monitor the climate impact of the project.
So there are quite a few options there for employers, contractors, and so on to start adopting to make the projects greener. But my immediate thought is that they all seem to be taking on additional obligations, which insurers will have something to say about.
Yes, I suspect they will. So looking first at some of the market pressures, insurers are in a similar boat to their potential insurers because they both face increased scrutiny of their approach to the financial risk from climate change and have the same growing societal pressure to be supporting green initiatives. The first big picture question there is whether insurers want to cover these risks at all. So the sorts of things we imagine, albeit not as underwriters ourselves, that will feed into those sorts of decisions are on the slide. But to briefly elaborate on them slightly, they'd include things like updating the actuarial models so that they account for the findings of studies on current and future projections of climate change, some greater scrutiny of emerging parts of the sector, which could, just for example, mean that those working in providing renewable energy are seen as riskier insureds. And lastly, taking a step back for a moment and considering the societal and market pressures and whether they're enough to warrant making the commercial decision to cover more climate risks as an early adopter, which might bring alongside it the opportunity for increased premiums given the uncertainty and early lack of capacity in the market. Now, in short, what that means, insurers might want to be careful when deciding which businesses and sectors to write to limit their exposure to risks associated with climate change and green initiatives. Conversely, though, some insurers might see it as an opportunity to win new clients and charge higher premiums. But either way, there'll be some PR consequences to be thinking about there too. Presuming insurers do opt to provide some form of cover, seems to us the natural follow-up is looking with a keener eye at potential insurers' climate policies when considering what terms and premium an insurer might want to offer. So that might mean, again, for example, proposal forms requiring details of what a potential insured's ESG policies are when they're on project, their awareness of climate issues like flood damage and intense heat, and their familiarity with the new technology being employed on the way to net zero. All of those are sorts of things that allow insurers to better understand the chance that the potential insured might fall foul of any climate-related issues they might end up covering. So, for example, design defects relating to the use of new tech.
So that's the broader picture. Can you take us through how this might feed into the actual terms of an insurance policy?
Well, again, there's a degree of speculation here because the market's evolving, but there are some things that are already applicable and in the works. It looks to us as though we may start seeing more specific extensions for risk relating to the new technologies and material that might be used to mitigate developing climate risks, or perhaps climate harming exclusions, albeit those climate harm exclusions are likely more relevant to D&O cover than PI cover. Another thing worth bearing in mind is the implication of insureds relying on warranties and guarantees regarding obligations tied to tackling climate change. It's already routine that PI policies exclude liability due to breach of any warranties or guarantee, particularly where they create a liability to the insured beyond that in tort. Now, that's something those in the industry will need to be all the more live to, given some of the market suggestions like Chancery Lane's climate standard of care. All in all, though, there's plenty to think about as climate change risks become an even greater focus.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. Let's finish up with some key takeaway points. So first, there's an increasing expectation on the construction sector to design and build in a way that reduces energy demand during the construction process itself, for example, through green materials and construction techniques. There's also a growing expectation to design and construct buildings fit for the future, whether that means incorporating electric vehicle charge points or ensuring a building can withstand a flood or intense heat. The building regulations already provide requirements for the construction industry with climate change in mind, and stricter obligations will come into play in 2025. The construction industry is starting to adopt clauses in contracts aimed at encouraging green approaches to building. And finally, on the one hand, some insurers might want to take care about the businesses and sectors they agree to write, so as to limit their exposure on risks associated with climate change and green initiatives. But on the other hand, some insurers might see it as an opportunity to win new clients. So this brings us to the end of today's webinar. If you have any questions on any of the subjects we touched on this morning, please let us know and we'll come back to you by email. Please do complete the feedback form, which will be on your screens when we sign off. Let us know in the form if you'd like us to speak on anything we've touched upon today in more detail or any other aspects of climate change. Feel free also to include any other topics you would like us to consider speaking about, and remember to contact us on LinkedIn if you wish to do so. Watch out for our updates with details of the next Breaking Ground webinar. And for now, we hope you'll be able to join us then and wish you a good rest of the day.